Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away in the title, really. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, release stories, distribution stories, all the ingredients that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation. It's really hard to make a movie. I'm going to move to the 1990s now, to a star vehicle that didn't set the box office alight and kind of got a little bit overwhelmed by stories of, two stars who didn't really get on. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. I'll come to the story of this film the other side of this.
She's a rookie reporter. He's an award-winning newsman.
Where you from, Peterson?
Look, I realize every cub reporter in the skirt must go gaga at the great bracket approaching them. You have zero chance of scoring here. Trust me. Move on.
I'm sorry, where did you say you're from? Bitchville?
Two big city rivals.
Delivery for Mr. Brackett.
Oh, by the way, I never did thank you for the mud.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope you named him after me.
I certainly did. Yeah, I've grown real attached to Little Dick.
Covering the same big story.
The train crashes, the son dies, and the briefcase is stolen.
And the closer they get to the
The
truth,
kid who stole it is murdered, but before he dies, he writes the initials LD on his palm.
the more they'll need each other to stay alive.
Somebody's trying to kill us over a cow hormone?
Is that what you think, Brackett?
Is that what you think, Peterson? Tell me if you think.
There you go. That was a bit of the trailer for 1994's I Love Trouble, a not really talked about Julia Roberts movie in which she co-starred with Nick Nolte. Directed by Charles Shire, written by Charles Shire and Nancy Myers. Nancy Myers produced the film, and alongside Roberts and Nolte were Sol Rubinek, Robert Loggia and James Rebhorn. This was a big summer Disney-backed release, a point where Disney was coming out of the era where it didn't want to pay movie stars. And so after 1990's Dick Tracy, headlined by Warren Beatty and Madonna, it went through a very frugal period where it's making lots of movies but not with massive stars. And I Love Trouble was one of the films where it kind of started to move towards where it would be by the end of the decade, when it was paying Bruce Willis to star in Armageddon, although there's a whole story and a half of how he ended up in that. That notwithstanding, there are a couple of things going on with the genesis of the film that became I Love Trouble, but the one at the heart of it was trying to come up with a modern spin on the kind of old Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy kind of films, with a male and female lead in the midst of some degree of caper, and it's all really lovely. And so in theory, that should have worked. Julia Roberts, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet at this point in her career. Nick Nolte had come off some very acclaimed stuff just at this point, the likes of Cape Fear and Lorenzo's Oil. So it should have been a big hit. But what I Love Trouble turned into was not only a box office failure, but one of the most notorious 1990s cases of Hollywood stars not getting on, and this being known even before the film was out. So Julia Roberts' career, I mean, she came to prominence off the back of Mystic Pizza and Flatliner. She became a full-on movie star off the back of 1990's Pretty Woman, and she was kicked around the tabloids. That underpins a lot of this story, actually, that she was treated horrifically by the tabloid press, that she was judged, she was pushed and pulled, she was presented in a really unfavourable light, when actually she was a woman in her early 20s just trying to make her way through life and had the glare of celebrity suddenly thrust on her. So after 1991's Hook, the Steven Spielberg directed film where she played Tinkerbell, she was fed up and she stepped away from the big screen, bar a cameo in Robert Altman's film The Player. And so it was a couple of years really before she would reappear. And when she did reappear, she signed a 2-year deal with a company called Caravan Pictures. Now, Caravan Pictures was headed up by a man called Joe Roth. Roth had headed up 20th Century Fox film output up until the early 1990s, but unusually for someone heading up a Hollywood studio, Joe Roth was a filmmaker. I mean, he would go on to direct films like America's Sweethearts. He did a film called Coupe de Ville as well. He had a couple of directorial credits. Really unthinkable now that a film director would be heading up overseeing a Hollywood studio, but that's where we were. And so Caravan Pictures had done a deal with Disney, which is what brought movie stars back into the ecosystem really of Disney's live action output. And Julia Roberts also agreed a 2-year deal with Caravan Pictures as well. So one of the films she was looking at the time was called In a County of Mothers, which was to co-star Susan Sarandon. Now, I think that migrated into 1998's Stepmom, which was set up somewhere else, directed away from Disney, and directed by Mrs. Doubtfire's Chris Columbus. I'm assuming it's the same project, although I can't find that confirmed. Roberts was, her first project back after her hiatus was a John Grisham adaptation, the film The Pelican Brief, opposite Denzel Washington, directed by Alan J. Pakula. That was due to in cinemas the end of 1993. And she reflected on her break from filmmaking in an interview with The Guardian back in 1994, and she talked about how the past 2 years have been 2 of the most incredible years of my life, and how she went travelling, she read more books than she did screenplays, she reconnected with old friends, she got married, and she really got a thirst for interesting films again. She said, I went with my instincts. As she told Variety, I was waiting for something perfect, and what I'd been looking for hasn't been around until now. A variety of projects then sprung up, and one of them was I Love Trouble, written by Charles Shire and Nancy Myers, who had enjoyed a success with Disney with the Father of the Bride remake, starring Steve Martin and Diane Keaton. And the pair of them had built up quite a career as well. They'd done Jumping Jack Flash, they'd done Baby Boom, they'd just written a film called Once Upon a Crime as well. It's an odd film, that is, as well. But Disney liked them. In 1991's Father of the Bride was a really solid hit. Steve Martin wasn't a massive movie star at the point he was cast either, and turned into a very profitable feature, and so they were soon committed to do Father of the Bride Part 2, which would follow in 1995. I Love Trouble, though, was going to be a high summer movie. This was going to come out in June of 1994, and so akin to a summer blockbuster really. Roberts was drawn to working with them, was interested in doing so, and so she committed to the idea of doing I Love Trouble. But it wasn't until 1993 that a male co-star was signed up to appear alongside her. That after Harrison Ford had been linked for a while, Variety reported in February 1993 that Nick Nolte had agreed to co-star in the movie. Now, Roberts, even though she committed to the film, hadn't actually signed on the dotted line, and wouldn't until she saw who she was going to be starring opposite. But content with Nick Nolte, she built herself an out, which she didn't take. She did sign on the dotted line, she did take the film, and she would come to a degree to regret it. The problem initially was that her schedule all of a sudden had gone from a bit famine to feast. That I Love Trouble was going to have to hold its production until September 1993 because she had her hands full with the aforementioned The Pelican Brief. She was going to go straight off The Pelican Brief onto I Love Trouble as well. But The Pelican Brief was moving by May of 1993. It would wrap up in November when some final reshoots took place. But the bulk of production was done in time for I Love Trouble to start filming on October the 4th, 1993. And it shot in the US. It shot in Los Angeles, in Wisconsin, in Chicago, in Las Vegas. It would be quite a long shoot. It wouldn't wrap up, and the last shots wouldn't be called until well into 1994. And there was an interruption, I should note, in the midst of it as well. That the earthquake that took place in Los Angeles in January 1994, that meant that they couldn't access their sets for a few days. I think other people had things a lot worse. That notwithstanding, there were one or two bumps, but this was a $45 million movie with a movie star and a highly regarded actor, plus a writing producing team who'd earned themselves some currency. But I mean, by Christmas of 1993, with I Love Trouble still in production, Roberts was now doing some press for the Pelican Brief, and she caused a bit of a stir, it would be fair to say, when she gave an interview for the New York Times, where already by this stage there were rumours that her and Nick Nolte were not getting on at all. I think if you see the final cut of the film, it's fairly clear that they're not massively enamoured when they're supposed to be a romantic partnering at the heart of it. And the quote in the New York Times read, "From the moment I met him, we sort of gave each other a hard time, and naturally we got on each other's nerves." Fair enough. And when she was asked about Nolte's reputation, I'm quoting the article, of behaving crudely on set, Roberts said, "While he can be completely charming and very nice, he's also completely disgusting. He's going to hate me for saying this, but he seems to go out of his way to repel people. He's a kick," she said. Now, this was pretty much unheard of, that a movie star talking about their co-star in a film that was shooting, that was set to be a big release the following year. And whether her tongue was in her cheek or not, the fact that she described him as completely disgusting was the football that was then kicked around. And to this day is the tag, when people remember the film, it's the tag that's kind of attached to it. Stories then, I mean, that was it. All bets were off. Stories began circulating about not only did Nolte and Roberts not get on at all, they were getting to the stage where if they could avoid it, they didn't even want to shoot their scenes together. That it was said that stand-ins were used so that one of them could shoot their material against a stand-in, then the other rather than the two actors in the same scene. Now, this was never confirmed nor denied, but it was what the tabloids and the trade press were kicking around at that point. And it was said that Charles Shire, who was directing, had to use an abundance of techniques to shoot around the fact that he didn't always have the two people he needed in front of the camera. Now, the Los Angeles Times joined in. It said those involved in the production say that Nolte and Roberts didn't get along. They claim tempers flared early on, peppered with a few Roberts tantrums along the way. See, that's interesting angling, isn't it? So again, Julia Roberts was the tabloid football, so she's the one that they first kick at. And in fact, the angle of the Los Angeles Times piece is against Roberts, really, I think. It wrote, Roberts reportedly wasn't thrilled with Nolte's machismo, so she would deride and insult her co-star. Some on the set claim that he became so annoyed with her attitude that he would do things to agitate her even more. The discord was so intense, the Los Angeles Times wrote, the sources say, the two played more to stand-ins than to each other. Now, as the release of the film got closer, they did try and play it down. I mean, Roberts, for instance, would tell Entertainment Weekly magazine that we had great high-spirited needling of each other, trying to get a rise out of each other. It's not an outright denial, but at least it sounds a bit more in the spirit of making a film together. Charles Shire talked about how impressed he was with Roberts. We were looking at film the other day, and our editor, Walter Murch, who's written terrific books, our editor said, she's got it. I think Julia would have been a movie star in any era. There is magic there with her. And Nancy Myers and Charles Shire would not fuel the stories either. And it's only like many years later that Nancy Myers has been asked and opened up about it. And she talked about how she talked to Slash Film. She said it was not a good situation. It was just unlike any experience I've ever had. And she said, if you talk to people I've worked with, we don't have unhappy sets. It's collaborative. And I would say, just to try to be polite about it, it was a film where the filmmakers, interestingly, didn't have their normal amount of input into how the shooting went. Now, she's not thrown tittle-tattle out into the world, and the filmmakers themselves have remained really quite quiet on it. But still, there was just the implication there. There was also thrown in that there was a little bit of pushback against Shire and Myers as well for, quote, demanding multiple takes of improvised dialogue. But still, most of the focus was on Roberts and Nolte, and I mean, it wasn't a case of people coming out and admitting it either, but it's one of those. If you come out and deny it, it becomes a story. If you come out and admit it, it's a story. The schedule of the film was intense as well. I mean, while this was going on, they were still all having to work together, knowing that these headlines were coming out in the press. In fact, the final shots weren't called until March of 1994. And in order to meet the release date that Disney had set of June the 29th, 1994, and why wouldn't it put it out then? I mean, it had a potential summer hit, that it had to be edited as they went along, which wasn't really the way that Charles Shire nor Nancy Myers has made their movies before. Disney still knew that it had the potential for a hit if it got this right, but also it had a troublesome movie. Now, the word around the film just simply wasn't pleasant, and the ink being directed at it was pretty hostile. Throw in the fact that Julia Roberts is in the middle of the story, well, they couldn't wait to come in and give it a kicking. What Disney decided to do was almost cut its losses in the way that it approached the marketing of the film. And it's a fairly late change it made, because the original plan was to push it as a kind of almost romantic Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy style film. But instead, it decided it was going to be on much safer ground to push I Love Trouble as a suspense thriller. And it marketed the disconnect between the trailers and the poster is really quite something, I think. But also, Disney would have looked at the box office returns of The Pelican Brief just before Christmas at Christmas 1993. That can't have hurt. That was a hit. A suspense thriller with Julia Roberts' name at the top of the call sheet. Well, let's capitalise on that. And so it did its about turn in its promotion. I would suggest what it came up with was quite a conflicted way of pushing a film that didn't get across at all the identity of the film. But still, the race to the finish line was also demonstrated by the fact that the score was changed really late in the day. I mean, some of the early posters for I Love Trouble had been printed with Elmer Bernstein's name on it, but Elmer Bernstein's film is not the one that accompanies the movie. He was replaced very late by David Newman, and it's only on later publicity that David Newman's name appears, and it's David Newman's score that ultimately accompanies the film. Now, Julia Roberts stumped up for the press junket. It's really important to push stuff like this as well, that she met her obligations on the movie, and she would a different Los Angeles Times report said that Disney said the various rumours of riffs are untrue. Well, clearly they were true, but there you go. Saying that all involved were complete pros on the set, and in a I Love Trouble press junket for which Roberts did back-to-back interviews for 2 days, Disney went out of their way to laud her performance. As Disney spokeswoman Terry Press was quoted as saying, "I wish more stars took a page from Julia's notebook. She recognised selling this movie was her job. She was unbelievably pleasant to people." Now, the film debuted in the US on June the 29th, 1994. By this point, Roberts was on to her next project. She was in the UK making Mary Riley with Stephen Frears. Now, I've had Stephen Frears on this podcast before, who's talked about the difficulty of that film. I might come to it separately in a standalone podcast. For the purposes of I Love Trouble, the reviews were just hostile. There was no way around it. That nobody in the critical fraternity, I suggest virtually nobody in the audience, was buying the coupling of Julia Roberts and Nick Nolte. And in terms of disastrous pairings of lead actors in films of this ilk of the 1990s, it's hard to think of a more mismatched bunch than those two. It's not. I went to see this actually when it came out in the UK. It came out a little while after the US release, and I can't say I disliked the film. I thought it was vaguely, perfectly entertaining. I mean, I never had an urge to go back to it particularly. But the word of mouth on it, no way around it. I mean, going into its opening weekend, this film was being targeted. It had crosshairs on it, and it opened like the high summer weekend, July the 1st to the 4th weekend in the US in 1994. And I Love Trouble opened. It limped out in 5th place with a $7.8 million opening. Against that, I mean, The Lion King had been out for a couple of weeks. That was the #1 movie, still grossing 34 million. The Shadow. Oh, I really like The Shadow. There's not many people who say that. But The Shadow was their Speed, Blown Away. These were the films that were outperforming it. And as the summer progressed, I mean, on its second week, it did another 5 million. Forrest Gump turned up that weekend for a 24 million opening, took the top slot. Again, The Lion King was doing well. Speed was doing well. Even The Shadow was outgrossing it, and rightly so, if you don't mind me saying. The Flintstones movie was dropping. True Lies came out the week after. Angels in the Outfield. And almost unthinkable for a Julia Roberts film, this was sinking. as the summer went. It dropped. It took a little while to drop out of the top 10, but it never really threatened the top half of the top 10 anyway. And in fact, by the time I Love Trouble had completed its US run, $30 million in the bank for a $45 million film with a movie star at its head. Still, there are advantages to having a movie star at the head of your film, because even if it's been kicked around like a critical football, you can still pony up $30 million outside of America, which is just what it did. The total box office return around the globe, 61.9 million off that 45 million original investment. It did a bit of business on video as well, but it is a film that I would suggest virtually all concerned moved on from very, very, very quickly. It didn't put Disney off movie star vehicles, but it certainly, I would imagine, caused a few meetings to happen. It's only recently, in more recent times, that I Love Trouble's stars. I've talked about it a little more. I mean, Nolte, in the immediate aftermath, would talk about how the film was the worst he'd ever done, and it was one that he just did for the money. But then he also talked around the time of its release, weirdly enough, in a variety piece. He said, I don't have a very safe career. And this was the week I Love Trouble came out, and then he was doing Jefferson in Paris and Blue Chips and I'll Do Anything We're Out. And he said, but I never took the money as a condition of what I do. I think this film, as he would go on to admit, was the one exception. But it was in 2022 when he was asked really about the apparent feud between he and Julia Roberts on the movie, and he was promoting a separate film at that point, one called Rittenhouse Square, and he just said he didn't have contact with her afterwards, but he just said that the hatchet is buried. He was asked if the two had buried that hatchet, and he just said, I mean, it was absurd what we went through. He said it was partly my fault and a little bit of hers. Julia got married at the beginning of that film, and it was one of those things where I approached it all wrong. And that was an interview he gave to Insider and then quickly moved on. For Nancy Myers, let's leave the last word to her. I mean, she would reflect to Vulture in 2020 of the experience of that film. She described it as, quote, unfortunate. And she did say that we had a lot of fun writing a script. We were young, we tried a genre that had danger and romance when people still wrote for newspapers and the newspapers weren't dead. And then it just sort of, well, what's the opposite of fun, she asked. That's what it was like. How's that for a poster quote? Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not completely bored you, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew, on Blue Sky at Simon Brew. Film Stories is on Twitter at Film Stories. We're at facebook.com/Film Stories online, youtube.com/Film Stories. The Patreon is patreon.com/Simon Brew. The shop is store.filmstories.co.uk. We've got a few Blu-rays left of No Way Out and Bull Durham, the UK Blu-ray premieres. Both of those films, we're still shipping those out. All of our print magazines are there as well. And then if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that's our website. It's got movie news, game news, television news, reviews, features, mischief, mayhem. The website broke this week because it had too much traffic on it, but you didn't need to know that. We think we've fixed it now, and we've got a whole collection of people who are running around wheels to try and generate the energy to keep the servers going. Thank you to everyone who's paid us a visit. Most important thing, as always, though, is that you're all well, that you all take care, and I will return soon with some more film stories. I've got a couple of specials coming your way as well, so please look out for that. Take care, look after yourselves. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye bye.